Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. Hope and pray that you enjoyed lunch. As we continue to reclaim the village, we certainly have to think about what does this mean for our children and for education. One of my conversations with our Fundi, Mama Itihari, she gave me an image of educators who had to fulfill state requirements and would have books that the state required on their desk, but they had subversive educational tools on their laps. And so what does it mean to take back the educational processes of our children and restore education for our future? I'm glad you asked that. We have a panel that is able to engage us and bring us into conversation. We are going to ask that the panel have ample opportunity to frame all that we're going to talk about, and at the moderator's request, we will then put mics in the aisle and you can raise your questions. Those who are watching via stream, you can also raise your questions as well. Do so on all of our platforms. We're watching and monitoring for questions. And so I'm going to put you in the hands of our able moderator, Dr. Ayanna Tillman.
Greetings to you all. It is wonderful to be sharing sacred, safe space with you this week of Ma'afa, reclaiming the village, restoring our past. I will yield to my colleagues on the stage to introduce themselves and make our introductions back on down to me.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's just a blessing to be here. This is my second year at Ma'afa. Last year I was here, I cried the entire time. I was so full. I'm doing better this year. I'm not crying as much, but the spirit is so strong and so sweet. And I'm just grateful to be in community with you all. It's such a blessing. I'm Natasha Thornton. Let me get to my introduction. I'm Natasha Thornton. I'm an assistant professor of elementary education at Spelman College. I've been in education for over 20 years, classroom teacher, literacy coach, consultant, professor, and I'm also the founder of Thornton Educational Consulting that centers Black scholarship and education and curricular materials. Thank you, and I'm so excited to be here.
Greetings, family. My name is Dr. Chike Akua. I'm an associate professor of educational leadership at Clark Atlanta University, and I'm also the creator of Reading Revolution Online, an online literacy program. We provide professional development to urban school districts, reading materials, and all the materials that will be necessary to create competent learners. I, too, feel very blessed to be here with you all. I first saw the Ma'afa production about 25 years ago in Atlanta. It was amazing then, and it was amazing last night when I saw it again. It's quite an experience. So, again, I feel blessed to be here and looking forward to the dialogue today.
And I am Ayanna Tillman. I currently serve as Associate Director for Enrollment Management and Student Experience at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, an 1886 land-grant historically Black college and university. And so my work spans from writing curriculum for early childhood education all the way up to adult learning. And I am passionate about this work, and I thank you all for being here today. It is our hope that during this hour and a half of reflection, we can address the topic, restoring Mbongi in the margins, refuturing our education. So throughout our time, we will touch the current state of education, restoring our journeys, and restoring on the front lines. And so we recognize that education takes shape and form in a myriad of ways, and that teaching is not separate from spirit work, but that they are one and the same. And sometimes that teaching can look like this. Well, son, I tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it, and splinters, and even boards torn up, places where there ain't been no carpet, bare. But all the while, I've been climbing on and reaching landings and turning corners and going in the dark sometimes where there ain't been no light. So boy, don't you sit down on that step because you finds it kind of hard. Don't you fall now, for I still going, honey. I still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair. Ashe. Ashe. And so in the spirit of our first teachers, in many cases our mothers, our aunties, our grandmamas and big mamas, our mamaws and papaws and uncles and cousins, we recognize that our first teachers are sent to us from community, from our first Mbongis, our families. We recognize that historically in Sunday school and church schools and Sabbath schools and vacation Bible schools, we are sent to those teachers to learn. And oftentimes we mystify education, we romanticize education, and we forget that many of our first teachers who we entrusted with our children were not formally educated as we seek to be sometimes today. But we trusted them to love our children, to feed them real good, and to teach them what they knew. And so we return as we've never left. Those teachers and that investment that they have in sharing their life's wisdom and stories, just as Langston Hughes wrote in Mother to Son. So reflect on your first teachers and what it was to learn at the feet of those masters as we dialogue into our journeys with our first teachers. Go and journey now with us.
Thank you, Ayana. So I want to start with thinking about the current state of education, right? It's important for us to understand where we are, what's happening with our children, because that is what reminds us and tells us the importance of restoring and to going back to who we are and who we come from. So I'm going to share a little bit about what's happening now, right? And then as we go along, we'll talk about, I'll get into the restoring piece. But when I think about the current context of education and what's happening, and it's not new, it's anti-Blackness that's pervasive in our society, that's pervasive in our schools. And so in the news, we see the debates around CRT, we see the book bannings, divisive concept laws, we see the revisionist history that tries to eliminate who we are and our legacies. And what helps me with that, and Yana said, like, we kind of mystify, education. In this sense, we have terms like anti-Blackness, white supremacy, racism, systemic oppression, but what does that look like day to day in schools with Black children? And I talk about with teachers these things in order to support them with reflecting and thinking about their practices and their behaviors, because what teachers believe can perpetuate these isms and these issues in school that are harmful to Black children. And so I think it's important for all of us to understand what's happening. And what helps me with this is going back to a piece that was written by Drs. Gloria Boutte, Lamar Johnson, and Nathaniel Bryant, where they talk about the 5 violences that Black children face in school. And I think it's important for us to understand what those 5 violences are specifically, so when we hear it in our communities and our children come back and tell us what's happening, we can when we hear it and see it, we can name it. We have language for it, and we need that so we can address it and navigate it. And so I'm just going to talk through quickly the 5 violences. And the first one is curricular violence. And I think we're all pretty much familiar with curricular violence. And so when we think, and I have my notes because I just know how my brain processes, and if I forget, I got it, it's right here. But curricular violence. So this is reflected in the instructional materials, the standards. It's reflected in the test that does not reflect and honor our students' racial identities, their culture, their history, their legacies. It's standards and teaching materials that are Eurocentric. And so when we think about the lack of diversity in schools and what it looks like, we can all know, right? We all probably know of Charlotte's Web, right? The spider and the pig, right? But what if we knew about Anansi, right? The West African folktale that talked about family, perseverance, community, and how to be in relation. What about that? Everybody in high school got to read Shakespeare at one point, at some point in high school, right? But what if the autobiography of Malcolm X was a quote-unquote canonical required text? What if we had to read Alice Walker and Maya Angelou, those stories that teach, preach, and touch the soul, right? That is when students don't get those opportunities, that is curricular violence. When we look at the curriculum in science, social studies, and math that teach about white men leaders, and in the vein of black women, we need to know about Kandake Amanirenas, a queen of Nubia who conquered Roman when they tried to come over and said, these are my people, I'm their leader, and I'm protecting them, right? We need to know about Mom Betts, one of the first black women to sue, well, enslaved black woman. She sued and she won her right to freedom. And you know why? Because subversively, the person that owned her, the slave master, was a lawyer. So while she was working, she was listening and she was learning subversively, and she got her freedom for herself and many others, right? When we learn about civic leaders, we need to learn about Magdalena Walker, the first black woman to own a bank, to have women working for her and help them create their own financial institutions. And when we don't learn about that, that is curricular violence. And why this is important, because curriculum shapes our identity, who we are, what we value, right? What we see as good, what we see as normal. Curriculum shapes our identity. And so us being able to address this curricular violence is critical, important in our work. The next one is linguistic violence. How black children talk or speakers of black language show up to school and they're told that their language is wrong. They told that they have to code switch in order to be successful in this world. They're overcorrected. It's not gonna, it's not finna, it's I'm going to, right? Did you say I want to see your paper, or it's your paper, right? It's not I be your friend, it's I am your friend. But what a lot of us don't understand is that leaving off the R at the end of words for yo and your, and saying I be instead of saying I am, is connected to Western African languages. When you deny black children their language, you're denying them their linguistic heritage. And when that happens, that's linguistic violence in schools. And what's important about that? Dr. Lisa Delpit and many others, Geneva Smitherman, a black woman, Lisa Delpit, April Baker Bell, they study black language along with a lot of other linguists. And what is important to know about black language is that it's more sophisticated than what we call standard English. It's rule governed. So that means the way that we say and do things is smarter, makes more sense than what we deem as standard English. Lisa Delpit says that our language is intimately connected to who we are. So the way children talk in their families to their mamas and daddies and papas, the way they talk in their communities and in their churches, they're told it's wrong, but that's connected to our identity. And we got to keep that, and we got to keep that for them. And we got to affirm them in their language. And when they can't do that in these schools, that's linguistic violence. The third violence is physical violence. We've seen it on the news. We've heard about it. And I pray no one in here has experienced, but maybe so because it's a real thing. When children are hit and grabbed and pulled out of their seats, they're drug on the ground. When you see 4 and 5 preschool-aged kids, right, with handcuffs, that's physical violence. School got to be a place where children feel they feel safe and a sense of belonging. Right, we have to restore that safety. When you can't look at a child and you don't see them the way the Creator sees them, then yes, you may be prompted to be physical with them. But we gotta be able to look at children and see them, truly see them. Symbolic violence. Symbolic violence is when black children can't come to school and just be themselves. Their black, rich, beautiful, cultural selves. When children show up to school and they turn away because the way their hair grows out their head, it's not okay, it's against the rules, right? It's through slurs that teachers and children say in school that are racist. That's symbolic violence. When Bettina Loves and other scholars talk about spirit murdering, when students come to school and can't be and do those things that make sense to them culturally, and we see that day to day. The last violence is systemic violence, and that's rules and policies that are deemed to be equitable and fair for all children, but are actually harmful for black children. You see it in policies, even like in gifted testing, right? When you see so many gifted black children in school, but they don't get, they aren't able to be tested because they don't meet those like pre-screener requirements. I have a friend, y'all, her daughter was in 2nd grade. The teacher would not test her for gifted. The mother knew better. She paid out thousands of dollars out of her own pocket to take her to get tested, evaluated. Baby girl's IQ was off the charts. She's in Mensa, okay? That's the organization for, I don't know nothing about Mensa because you gotta have a really, really, really high IQ to be in Mensa, right? But baby girl was in Mensa. The pre-screener refused, right, to capture that in her. The teacher refused to see it in her. The beliefs, those practices, they're systemic in our society, and they perpetuate these systemic violences. So those 5 violences to me are at the core, the foundation for what we see as the current state of education. But what I know and what I'm hopeful for is in our restoring, right, we have not, this ain't nothing new. This ain't nothing new. They've always tried to keep education from black people, but again, subversively, we've always taught our children who they are and whose they are. And so a part of this work in education is to ensure that our community and our educators are steeped in those restoring acts, right, for the children and themselves. Thank you.
Let me just piggyback on that. And of those 5 violences, if you would raise your hand if you have experienced them. But I'm going to read them out again. If you see me on my phone, it's because I'm taking notes, because I'll be in another city at another time, and I'll be able to say, Dr. Nastasia said this and this, and I like to pull up my notes. But I'm going to call out these violences, and as she mentioned, there are 5 of them. And all I want you to do is hold your hand up for the number of violences that you have experienced. Ashe? Curriculum, every hand should go up for that, y'all. Linguistic, physical, symbolic, and systemic, meaning rules and policies. So hold your hand up with the number out of 5 of those that you have experienced, okay? Now keep your hand up. Put your hand way up so we can, now look around the room. Look around the room. Okay. Okay, hands down. I got at least 4. So before I deal with those 5 violences, I want to center first the revolutionary educators who went into the system knowing that it was not created for us, but went in with a mission, a purpose, and a plan to be that kind of subversive teacher that we were talking about earlier. When I think of the context of education today, I wanted to center those teachers and those leaders because I've been able to see that when you put resources in conscious and competent hands, amazing things begin to happen. When I say conscious, I'm talking about mindset. When I talk about competence, I'm talking about skill set. Ashe? And so I've seen some amazing things happen, but as I was taught by Nana Baffour Amakwechi II, Dr. Asa Hilliard III, the more successful those revolutionary teachers and leaders are, the more they come under attack. Interestingly enough, some of the most powerful, most progressive educational leaders that I've seen around the country have come under attack, not for failure, but for success. I'll give you a quick example. What comes to mind, or who comes to mind, is Mama Chris Wiggins in Philadelphia. She founded Imhotep Charter High School in Philly. They started off in trailers. They had an African-centered curriculum. She raised the money to build a $10 million state-of-the-art facility. And even before they got into that facility, they were doing outstanding academically, athletically, and in the community. And as the school began to grow, they had a 100% graduation rate, college-going rate, won the state in basketball and football. So we're talking about academic and athletic powerhouse. And yet the very same school that she helped to build was snatched from her by the board. And this is not an isolated incident. We've seen this happen at a number of different schools around the country. But I wanted to center the revolutionary educators who are doing the work on the front lines every day. Now, if you have a phone with you, would you hold it up for just a second? Just hold it up. Okay. So the reason I wanted you to hold it up, now I want you to look at it for just a moment. I know we don't typically want people looking at their phones during the presentations, but I want you to think for just a moment how long ago you got that phone, and if you probably need a new one about this time. Now, I don't know about you, but my sons have to tell me when I need a new one. They're like, Dad, what is that? You walking around with a dinosaur. What is that, like an iPhone 10 or something, right? And I'm like, well, it works fine for me. They're like, you need to get a new phone. Or some of us may have a cracked screen or something. So if you're at the point, and I'm going somewhere with this, so stay with me. If you're at the point now where you're about in need of a new phone, maybe you've maxed out the memory or something, would you raise your hand? Keep your hand up. Look around the room. Okay. So that's not by chance that you need a new phone. And those that didn't have your hands up, you will have your hand up in about a year or so. And the reason for that is a concept in the technological industry called planned obsolescence. Planned obsolescence is when the designers of the product make it to intentionally be functional only for a certain period of time, and then it's rendered useless. It can no longer work with the current software. Are you all following me? And so when I look at the current state of education, what I see is planned cultural obsolescence. I see curricula, I see teaching methods, I see standards that are meant to make our children absolutely useless, except in their ability to make white people money. So we're not taught how to meet needs and solve problems in our communities. We're taught how to meet needs and solve problems for other people. And our value is only associated to that. Ashe? And so, and the reason I ask you to hold up your phone and to look at your phone is because I want you to think about that concept every time you pick up your phone. Ashe? This idea of planned cultural obsolescence, I need for you to understand that it is not by happenstance, it's not by chance, it is extremely intentional. So bear this in mind. At no time in the history of these yet-to-be United States, as Dr. Maya Angelou would say, has education been equitably funded for black children. Wrap your mind around that for just a moment. At no time in the history of this nation has education been equitably funded for black children. There's a reason for that. There's also a reason for the backlash that we're seeing as it relates to DEI and different things of that nature, and the pushback with CRT, which is really a manufactured crisis. Y'all know that, right? Teachers aren't teaching CRT. That's an advanced theoretical concept. But there are teachers who are teaching children to think critically, analytically, and reflectively, and to examine their surroundings, to examine people, policies, and procedures to find out whether they're actually for them or against them. And so prior to the pandemic, we were dealing with a lot of challenges. Coming through and out of the pandemic, those challenges have only escalated exponentially. And so I believe it's almost leading up to a point where they're trying to do away with public education. And I need for you to understand, while I have a particular critique of public education, our ancestors were the ones that invented public education. Now, I'm not just speaking in generalities. I can take you back to ancient Kemet in the Nile Valley, Kemet, Nubian, Kush. Guess what? You had free public education, watch this, for males and females. You can't say that in Europe. When we go to West Africa, in the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, you had free public education for who? Males and females. When the Moors, as an act of vengeance against white terrorism, when the Moors went in and ruled Spain from 711 AD to 1492, one of the first things that they did was they established schools, free public schools for males and females. Don't you know that when enslaved Africans in America, one of the first things that we did upon emancipation and before emancipation was to establish free public schools, watch this, for males and females, and not just black folks, for all people. You do know they didn't even want poor whites being educated, because all they wanted poor whites to do was to keep the enslaved in line and in check. They don't need education to do that. And so as Du Bois talks about in Black Reconstruction, that public education in the South was a Negro idea, but we want to link it back up to our ancestors in Africa. And so we have to go back to our original standards and raise up a new standard of what education looks like and should be. The problem is most have never been exposed to the pillars of excellence that we established. They don't know about the African or the African-American tradition of excellence that we established. And that's just kind of a brief overview of the current state of education.
Absolutely. We share these truths that are self-evident in us and in our communities. And this work is work that we are called to do in restoring and restoring our communities. We think back, and many of you in this room can relate and remember a time in American history that we called segregation. And at that time, because of the inequities and inequalities experienced in education, our foreparents sought and thought it best that integration be a part and be adopted into the fiber and into the tapestry of our history. But we recognize that in the spirit of Sankofa, as we go forward, we look back to remember and to fetch the very best of who we were, who we are, and where we seek to go as we plant for the generation ahead. And so if we think back to a time when all of our teachers looked like us, when there was language around communication because we were speaking a similar language, a similar dialect, we recognize that in that very structure, the imagery, the experiential learning that we received was a reflection of our own homes and our communities and our churches. And oftentimes, the teachers in our schools were also active members of our churches. And in those church environments and those spiritual sacred spaces, the janitor at the school could be the pastor of a church. We recognize that oftentimes where there was this duality between spirit and truth in education, the church was where those lines were blurred in such a beautiful way, and we learned to do the divine dance in and out of the spirit realm and in and out of the spirit work of education. And so one of our great ancestral leaders calls us to remember that spirit work is educational work. They are not separate. And so Nsaka Sunsun is a concept, Nsaka Sunsun, N-S-A-K-A, S-U-N-S-U-M, Nsaka Sunsun, calls educators to first touch the spirit of our students. And so it is when you're able to draw out the mystery and the mastery and the magic of our children that we see them show up in their fullest form and fullest selves. And as we talked about the inequities in education and in our language and communicative systems, we recognize that our children come here with their own language. When they begin talking, and we call it babble, and they are so intent, and they are so intent in what they're saying, and then we socialize them away from that natural knowing. We say in African thought, they come from the realm of all knowing, and they come here to share messages with us. So to teach an African construct is not about standing in front of a classroom and being the only one who knows the answer, but it is about forming the magic circle where no one is in front and no one is behind, and the teacher is a part of the circle of learning, because the greatest teachers know that they learn from their students. And that is where we glean and grasp by listening. And so in the sacred text, Jesus says, suffer that the little children come unto me. Do not stop them from coming. Allow them to come and sit at the feet of the masters, and the masters sit at the feet of the children, because they are the masters. And so when we listen with the heart and the ear of intentionality around hearing what they have to say and who they are, then we are able to observe and witness the most divine, sacred experience in education. And so one of our teachers, Dr. Wade Noble, says that our greatest barrier to education is not what the student knows, but what the teacher believes. And so it's out of this system of belief. I believe you can. I know the next spelling test, you're going to get 100% because I believe in you. That system of belief allows that spirit to now take flight. And it's not about right or wrong. It's not about numeric value and systems around grades, which I love so much about my mama Itihari Ture as an educator, is that she understands that outside of this system of numeric value, there is value in the cycle, in the system, in the developmental stages of learning. And if I can assess that from where you stepped in and where you entered this realm of learning to where you are at the end, then I know that you have learned. I know that you have gleaned. I know that you have gathered along the way what was of value to you in that system. And if we will embrace all of that around our students, our learners, whether they are children or adult learners, we recognize all that is in them, all that is in us as the first people. And so a first people are the creators of language, of symbols, of communication. So everything that follows it is us. We lean into Freud and Piaget and Erikson and all of these Eurocentric psychologists with their psychobabble, but we don't trust the babble of our children who are coming from the realm of all-knowing. And have you know that their babble, their information and education is developed from Afrocentric constructs of learning. So we must then go back within and trust that what is in our communities is sacred. That our stories of scripturalization, as Vincent Wimbush says, are as sacred as Matthew, Mark, Peter, and Paul. If you would turn your life into information on written pages, and if you were to bury that book, and it was to be dug up 100 or 500 years from now, and your life becomes scripture, are we too sacred? Have we romanticized and fantasized education beyond our own knowing and excellence and our own ingenious? Sit with that for a moment. What is it to be the house or the book of Teray? What is it to have a house or book of Pew? What do those sacred stories entail? And who would glean and what would be gleaned from them? This is the invitation into sacred memory work and into spirituality as education.
Woo. Come on, Sister Ayana. It's just, And so, and even to do and to be in the work, in the space, in the spirit, as Ayana just talked about, we all have work to do, and we all have different starting points. So I'm going to share a bit about my journey that I'm still on, my restoring that I'm still in the midst of and will always be in the midst of. And like Ayana said, to show up in the ways that our Black children need, we gotta believe. We gotta believe, but I'm gonna be honest. I know all y'all in here believe. Y'all always have believed, but I didn't. And I'm just gonna be real with that as a Black educator of Black children. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about my story and the restoring that I experienced, and again, still experiencing. I've always taught, in a classroom, I taught Black children in schools with Black children and Black teachers, and I loved my children, I loved their families. I'm still connected with many of them today. But I still had norms and practices that were steeped in whiteness. I loved my children. I did not teach I taught a curriculum that didn't love them, that didn't affirm them. And so I'm going to, in true teacher story time fashion, I'm gonna read a little bit to y'all. In a book that I wrote with some good friends about revolutionary love, truly loving children and who they are and truly affirming their identities, we talk about the importance of knowing systems. So we talk about the violence. If we're gonna disrupt and navigate, we gotta know what we're dealing with, right? So knowing systems, but also knowing self. And so this is an excerpt from my story of knowing and doing critical reflection on myself, which is key to, again, my restoring. So in the early 2000s, I was a classroom teacher. I truly loved my students, and I built close relationships with their families, just like most of my colleagues. Yet, I held views which were steeped in deficit beliefs, specifically classism and other ways of thinking, deficit ways of thinking, about Black people, Black children and families. We shared the same racial identities, but I had deficit beliefs. They differed, the children, I would say, in families, I would say that they differed in other ways, such as their use of African American language, right? In professional settings, or their socioeconomic status. As a Black woman, I had internalized beliefs about my own racial group. Now, this is difficult for me to say. It was difficult for me to write. I would have conversations with colleagues that questioned how parents would buy expensive shoes but not school supplies, or how parents would attend field day but not academic conferences. it did not occur to me that what parents experience as students, right, their engagements with their own teachers, or even as adults coming up to school, how they were perceived, how they were treated, shaped if they came to school or not. I didn't think about, like, a lot of the jobs that the parents had didn't offer the flexibility of getting off, coming into late meetings or during the day. That didn't resonate with me. I was absolutely conditioned by white supremacy, by dominant deficit beliefs that did not value our rich cultural resources. And I blame the Black people, I blame the parents and the students for the outcome of racism, of economic oppression, of all of those things that is rooted in anti-Blackness. I blame them for. I didn't have that critical lens, that insight. In 2007, though, I took some reading courses at Georgia State. It was the first time that I had ever read in those courses books by Black women scholars. Y'all, I had a bachelor's degree, I had a master's degree, and I stood in front of Black children for 5 years and had never read a book by a Black scholar, education scholar. Gloria Ladson Billings, that was the first book I read, The Dream Keepers, Successful Teachers of African American Children. She conceptualized the term culturally relevant pedagogy. A lot of people were writing about it in different ways. She coined that term. Dr. Lisa Delpit, that's why I started learning about linguistic justice. She wrote Other People's Children, Cultural Conflict in the Classroom. Those texts were transformational for me. When I went back to school, I began to see my students in the context of their cultural identities. But don't get it twisted. I've always been happy, proud to be Black, right? Even before I started my program, I was over the Black History program. I made sure my students had, books that with characters that and people that look like them. But I felt if they're their best Black selves and they will ace these tests, they will get those grades, they will do what this curriculum is asking them to do. I wasn't critical about the curriculum. I love being Black, I love my children, and I wanted them to be good for that. I did not have the knowledge and the understanding to critique and disrupt that system that wanted to shift and change who they were. When I started my doctoral program, and this is where the crosswords came, y'all. So I went back to school teaching kindergarten. I moved to 4th grade. In 4th grade, kids got to take those standardized tests, right? I didn't have to deal with that in kindergarten. When we got the test scores my first year, and y'all know how it is, the north part of the county, test scores through the roof, more fluent, more white. South, where I was teaching, test scores were low. And that pierced me because I taught them students every day and I knew their genius. I knew their brilliance. I said, something is going on socially, culturally, politically, economically that I can't speak to, that I can't teach to. So I decided to go and learn some more. And so I went to my PhD program and I took a class by Dr. Joyce King. And in that class, I learned that Black people started the first schools, okay? I learned that we always did the work to disrupt. You know how we have achievement gaps, literacy gap, high school education gap? We did the work to disrupt all of those gaps. From the early 1700s, we always did that. And learning that shifted something in me. I knew that if I would have learned this about myself and my people early on, I would have walked in this world with my head held differently. I would have tapped into my cultural resources. I wouldn't have been made to feel in PW. I went to school in majority white spaces. I wouldn't have questioned myself. I wouldn't have questioned my identity. I would have questioned my work because I would have known who I am and whose I am. And so in those spaces of learning, they were transformational for me. And my continued learning around, like I talked to a couple of people here, I'm still learning and new in this spiritual connection with education. But y'all is so rich, and I feel it is so real. So I can't wait to come back in a couple of years and talk about this restoring journey, okay? But what I do know in learning about myself and our people, the richness of our culture, the richness of our history, in that I began to understand teaching as spirit work, divine work. Teaching is divine, teaching is spirit work. And so that it wasn't until then I immersed myself in that what came to me. And also that was key to my restoring journey. I had to follow the Spirit. And so in all of us, we have to follow the Spirit. When I went to my PhD program, I left the classroom. I went as a full-time student. Good friends of mine said, Tasha, that's crazy. Just teach and do your PhD program. I could, and it was something in me that just didn't make sense. It didn't feel good. I followed the Spirit. At Kennesaw State, I was a professor. I was on track to get tenure. I left because my spirit couldn't get settled. And that's when that's when I met Mama Itahari. That's when I met Akoswa Lassane. That's when I met y'all beautiful Black people. And I start learning about Amos Wilson, Dr. Hilliard, Janice Hale, all of the beautiful Black educators that tell us who we are, right? That help us remember the pieces that we got to put together. And so in my restoring, it was knowledge of self and following my spirit.
Ashe, my story begins with, I'm the son of Dr. Joseph Fenwick and my mother, Faye Fenwick, and they have very, very demanding standards. I'm the last of 5 children. We grew up going to Catholic schools, which was an interesting process. I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, and we were one of very few Black students in those schools, but we had a family and a community that surrounded us and loved us. But if you're familiar with Jawanza Kunjufu's work, he talks about the 4th grade failure syndrome. And it happened 2 years later for me. When I was in 6th grade, I went from getting A's and B's and maybe an occasional C to getting a lot of D's. And that started in 6th grade. And I didn't recover from that until the 12th grade. So going into 12th grade, I had a 1.9 GPA. Now, I appreciate that response. Like, you're surprised. Some places I go, they just look at me like, yeah, you look pretty dumb to me, you know. So, but it was during that time my sister came back. She graduated from college, and she began to tutor me. An interesting thing happened, though. None of her tutoring with me was academic in nature. It was more social emotional. I literally went from a 1.9 GPA to a 3.2 the next semester. But 3 years of a 1.9 doesn't average very well with one semester of a 3.2. So now I have a dilemma. I'm the last of 5 children. My parents didn't really have the money to send me to school. And I didn't earn a scholarship like my sister and brothers had done. But I did get accepted on probation to Hampton University. But I'm still in a dilemma. I see one of my Hampton people back there. Ashe. Yes. Hampton's in the house. So I had a dilemma. I got accepted, but how am I going to go? And my mother came and she told me, we're going to find a way to get you there. And an interesting thing happened. My sister, who had been taking a cab to work every day, saving her money to get a car, used her money to pay the $600 for me to go to pre-college. My mother took her credit card, which was charged to the max, somehow got an extension on it, and was able to purchase me a plane ticket. So, yeah, right, no pressure, right? So my father and my mother were driving me to the airport on the day that I'm supposed to leave. And my father drops my mother and I off at the curb while he goes to park. And we walk into the airport. And my mother did something that I had never seen her do before or since. She completely broke down in the middle of the airport and started praying. Oh, Lord, my baby is going off to college. Help him to find success. Help him to act like he got some home training. Keep him from all hurt, harm, and danger. We're in the middle of the airport, y'all. I'm like, Ma, chill. And she's praying and crying and crying and praying. But I wanted to cry too, because I knew how hard my parents had worked, and I should have earned a scholarship. So I literally got on that plane as one person and got off of that plane as a new person. Ashe? In the pre-college program, I had to have at least a 2.0 to be accepted as a full-time student in the fall. I didn't get a 2.0. I didn't get a 2.5, 3.0, or 3.5. I got a 4.0. Ashe? Yes. So my goal then was to then go back and teach the type of students that I was. Students who had tremendous potential, but may have gotten caught up in the public school system. Ashe? And to give you an example of how we're marginalized and the different violences that Dr. Natasha mentioned a moment ago, when I was a junior in high school, the one class that I did well in was expository writing. I loved writing. And I needed that class because that was the only class I knew I was going to get a good grade in. We turned in a paper on Friday. We got the paper on Monday. I was one of only a few black students in my entire grade level. And every paper that I got was either a 90, a 95, or a 100. Well, this one particular Monday, as I was waiting to get my paper with great anticipation, I got my paper back and there was no grade on it. Just at the top, it said, "See me." Raise your hand if you've ever gotten one of those papers before, right? So I went up to the teacher and said, "You wanted to see me?" And he looked at my paper and he said, "Oh, yeah, now I remember why I wanted to see you. What does this word mean?" I told him what the word meant. He said, "What does this word mean?" I told him what that word meant. He went through like 5 or 6 words. I told him what the word meant, the dictionary definition, and the context of how I used it in the paper. He still looked at me and said, "You didn't write this paper." Not did you write this paper, you didn't write this paper. He didn't know that I would go on to graduate with honors from college. He didn't know that I would go on to become a language arts teacher like him. He didn't know that my colleagues would vote me Teacher of the Year. He didn't know that Ebony Magazine would name me one of the 50 leaders of tomorrow. He didn't know that I would write my first book by the age of 25, write 8 books by the age of 35, and we're on book number 13 right now. He didn't know that I'd be written up in Black Enterprise and be on radio, television. He didn't see none of that from me. You want to talk about spirit murder. But I'm so blessed because I had a family safety net that caught me. And what has been the saving grace of black people for generations has been the family safety net. And then if the family broke down, then you had the community safety net, of which the church is part and parcel. Ashe? But what happens when the family safety net breaks and the community safety net breaks? And those are the type of children that I was called to teach. Ashe? And when you talked about the difference between segregated schools and integrated schools, my parents went to segregated schools. My mother went to the prestigious Sumner High School in Kansas City, Kansas, academic athletic powerhouse. It was such a powerful school that children went there instead of the Catholic schools, which is almost unheard of today. Ashe? The bishop actually came to my mother's home to try to get my grandmother to send her children to the Catholic school, and she refused. Not because she didn't have the money, but because it was a lesser school. My father went to the famed Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., academic athletic powerhouse. And so, interesting question that I asked my parents. I took them to see the movie. Y'all remember the movie Hidden Figures? A number of years ago, I took them to see that. I wanted to see what they thought about it. And what they said was very interesting. They said, those black women mathematicians, that were in the movie, They were incredible, but they were not exceptional. I said, what do you mean? They were incredible, but not exceptional. They were not the exception to the rule. They said all we knew was brilliant black professionals in math and science. So I asked my father, because he went to Meharry Medical School, and then when he left Meharry, he went to University of Michigan and got a master's degree in public health. I said, well, what was that like, going from Meharry to Michigan, Big Ten, Research One University, in terms of the rigor and what you learn? Which was more difficult, Meharry or Michigan? He said, man, please. Yeah. No comparison. What those professors instilled in us at Meharry, by the time I got to Michigan, it was a cakewalk. And so what I heard over and over when we talk about Sumner High School in Kansas City, Kansas, and we talk about Dunbar in Washington, D.C., these were not only academic and athletic powerhouses, they routinely outperformed white schools every single year. This is the achievement gap nobody's talking about. What did we have going on back then that allowed us to achieve and excel beyond all the odds with all of the roadblocks and stumbling blocks in front of us? But now we're having trouble, now that we're so-called integrated and sophisticated. Ashe? So that's a little bit about my background that fuels the passion that I have to reach our students.
Yes. Yes. For me, it is an encompassing of these stories. I am from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, rural agricultural town, and my parents met at the HBCU I currently work with. And so the interesting thing about that experience is that the founders for the church, the Black United Methodist Church, a mile from the institution, are also the founders for the institution. And so those black spiritual people understood before we were yet born the value of educating black people in a context that was all their own. And so I grew up with parents who were first-generation college students. And so they had to find their way in the educational system, and they did. And they became educators. My mother, a psychotherapist at the Black Institution for 40 years. My father directed the Upward Bound program. Some of you may know of that program that was all about getting black high school students into post-secondary education and beyond. And so education was a part of my home. When we went on road trips, we would recite black poems like this one by County Cullen called Incident. Once riding in old Baltimore, heart-filled, head-filled with glee, I saw a Baltimorean looking straight at me. Though I was 8 and very small, and he was not much bigger, I smiled, and he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until December, but of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. And so these kinds of stories became woven into the fiber of my being. And I internalized them, and I heard stories from various family members about the narratives that were spoken into them, even in segregated black schools, like, you ain't college material. You need to go and get you a trade, because I don't see you being too much of anything. These were the narratives that were digested by people of color who yet persevered through many dangers, toils, and snares. And so as I grew up, there was this consciousness and this trust for not only black excellence, but black enterprise and black brilliance and black scholarship. And so as I went on past my Eurocentric high school experiences and many, many cultural shocks in that regard, when I had the opportunity to choose a college or university for my bachelor's degree program, I chose Bowie State University as one of the first black teacher colleges on the Western Shore of Maryland. And I went on to study psychology at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, where I currently work. But I still had this call, this tugging to ministry. And so I began preaching in the pulpit in the United Methodist Black Church at 13 years old, because black women preachers saw something of value in me. That child gonna be somebody. She gonna preach the word of God, which is very similar to the experience you all noted. And I believed that. And so I was still seeking and chose the Interdenominational Theological Center, or the ITC, in Atlanta, Georgia, to pursue a master in divinity after a professional master's in rehabilitation and counseling, because I wanted to understand human behavior. But I also wanted to understand the situatedness of God in our human behavior as people of color. And God has always been central in the work we do. And at ITC, I experienced one like no other. It is the only all-black ecumenical seminary in the world. As far as I'm concerned, it is the birthplace of the practice of Afrocentrism and spirituality. And I saw that duality among the brilliant professors and leaders at the Interdenominational Theological Center. And so, recognizing all of that, I'd like to share with you a quote from Dr. John Henrik Clarke, powerful black educator. He says, "If you expect the present day school system to give history to you, you are dreaming. This we have to do ourselves. Powerful people cannot afford to educate the people they oppress. The Chinese didn't go out into the world and beg people to teach Chinese studies. The Japanese didn't do it either. People don't beg other people to restore their history. They do it themselves. This is what we call restoring on the front lines. It is developing a new narrative, a new way forward, but reflecting on our past, understanding who we are building for. And although we may not make it to the promised land, we're building it for our children and our children's children's children, so that they can step into a reality that is more realistic to who they are, like sweet black baby Jesus. Imagine if our first images, and some of yours may be, are of a black Jesus, or of a God who is woman. Imagine turning those narratives on their heads, the Ori, the seat of consciousness, so that we can be more aware and more conscious to teach in our own context, because it is the best, and because it is what's good and what's right for us. And so, this is a collective work that we do. There's a story that's told of an anthropologist who went over to Africa, to a tribe of people who look like us. And they had the children to play a game. And they set some sweet fruits at the end of a line, and they stood the children up at the beginning, and they told them to run, and the first one to get there would be the one to be able to have the first sweet fruits. And so when they counted down 3, 2, 1, the children took each other's hands and ran together to the fruit. And when they got the fruit, they shared it one with another. And the anthropologist, in his Eurocentric mind and worldview and mores and folkway, asked the children, why did you do that? Doesn't make any sense. I said whoever got there first would be the winner and would get the prize. And the children explained the concept of Ubuntu, that I am because we are. And so we have always been a tribal people, while Eurocentrism and Western culture calls us to the survival of the fittest. Don't matter if my neighbor's starving, hungry, lame, crippled, I'm gonna step right over him or her and I'm going to get for myself. That's a survival of the fittest mentality and worldview. But we as tribal people understand the survival of the group, the survival of the tribe. That if one of us is hungry, all of us are hungry. And if one of us will eat, all of us will eat. This is a work we must do ourselves. That's in us. That's about reclaiming our right to humanity. Because I am human only because you are here with me and you are human. And so this is the work of spirit and education. It is that each one reach one and teach one. And we have committed to this sacred work, to the value of this sacred teaching, and for this work to continue as the seeds planted that will grow into beautiful nations in our communities. And so with the last few minutes we have, I want to offer the opportunity for my colleagues on the panel to share any last words, and then we will open the space for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayanna. And so just a few final thoughts as we talk about restoring on the front lines. I can recall quickly, I was at a conference at Georgia State. It was called the Sources Conference for Urban Education. And I was sitting in a session with Dr. James Young. I don't know if he's still at Clark or he just retired from Clark. And I know he put up a slide and he had black psychologists and educators. And he said, if you are not teaching this in your classroom, then you are doing a disservice to your students, that you are the pre-service teachers that's going out there, right, and the children that they will serve. And on this slide, there was Dr. Naeem Akbar, Dr. Asa Hilliard, there were other scholars, and I can't think of everyone, but what I knew, I said I got some work to do. And that was right at the end of me leaving Kennesaw State. So I wasn't with student teachers. I wasn't with students that were going to be teachers. I was with teachers. I did a lot of work with teachers. And so now that I'm back in the classroom, every student that goes through my curriculum classes, if Brough and Brent is in a textbook, you're going to learn about Amos Wilson, okay? If Maria Montessori is in a textbook, we learning about Gloria Lasson Billings, Geneva Gay, Jacqueline Jordan Irvine, right? When we talk about the developed Piaget, all those people that you name. And so what I do with my students now in order to support because what's important, Dr. Asa Hilliard said that the purpose of curriculum is to foster purpose, belonging, in black children and teachers. And so in the work that I do with teachers is to foster their purpose and belonging, because when we talk about restoring and knowing who we are, many of the teachers that are teaching now, they went through the same system that they're teaching in. So they didn't get the black history in school. If they got it, it was in the church, it was in the community, it was in their families. And so when I do this work with them, and they're telling me about the great things that they're doing with their students, and they want to do more, but we need more resources. I need to know these stories. And so what my students do, we do a Black Educator Legacy Project. So in curriculum, everything that my students do around lesson planning, around developing a classroom environment, around assessment, around differentiation, they have to frame their work in a black scholar and a black psychologist. And so that work right there is the spirit work between a teacher educator and a pre-service teacher. And so this is my first year doing that work, and I am learning so much from my students. Like you said, we learn from the student, that eldering process, that back and forth, that reciprocal process is beautiful. And in that work is they're learning about black teachers. And you talked about black teachers. The black teaching tradition is what Dr. Akosua Losane has conceptualized. And so when they're learning about practices, they're learning from black teachers. Everything that we're trying to do to make right in education, We just got to look at Black educators. We got to look at Black scholars. And so that's the work that I'm doing with my students to Restoring on the Front Line. And in addition to that, with the work that I do around curriculum development, me and other Black women teachers, we've created stories of excellence. And these are stories of Black history and excellence for teachers around topics that are taught in social studies. So if you have to teach about World War II, you need to teach about Hannibal Barker and a military genius strategist, right? If you're teaching about World War II, you got to teach about Double Victory. You got to teach about the 688 Black Women Battalion. So all of these stories that support us with knowing who we are and where we come from. If you're talking about government, let's talk about the Black women in government, right? And so Stories of Excellence has stories of Black women, Shirley Chisholm, Ketanji Brown Jackson, Constance Baker Motley, right? Who were leaders who showed us the way, and the way that we came up with this from what Mama Iti Harris and others talk about is studying our victories, right? So we're doing the work now of teaching Black children. What did those victories look like in the past? Study those so we can tap into, glean from, and teach our children in the ways in which that they need to be taught. And so just to finish up with that, when we talk about identity, purpose, and belonging for children, it's imperative that we do the work with teachers, right? Because when we talk about anti-Blackness, it's not just the 5 violences against Black children. Anti-Blackness is also pervasive to hinder Black teachers from teaching in their purpose and their calling and their belonging. And so Restoring on the Front Line is in community with teachers and children. Thank you.
Ashe. And Dr. Natasha, you do the same thing with your students that I do with mine. And the way that I explain that to my students is, first of all, I teach mostly doctoral students and a few master's students. So sometimes they'll ask me to be on their dissertation committee. And I ask them, what theories are you using after we go through their research design? And, you know, they'll tell me Bronfenbrenner and others and so forth. And I got to the point where I said, don't even ask me to be on your committee if you're not using at least one Black theory. And the reason for that, as I teach in my research methods class, is there are no white solutions to Black problems. Y'all didn't hear me on that. Let me say it again. There are no white solutions to Black problems. There may be a few useful tools, but Bronfenbrenner ain't raised one Black child successfully. Neither has Maslow or Piaget or any of those. When I was going through initiation into the Jegna Collective, which Mama Iti Hari was instrumental in, this was over 20 years ago, with Dr. Hilliard, we were taken into Dr. Hilliard's basement, and he showed us some videos from the Marcus Garvey School in Los Angeles. And these were children that were 3 and 4 and 5 years old, just doing amazing things that you wouldn't think a 3, 4, 5-year-old would do. They're showing 3rd graders doing calculus, right? It was just amazing to me. And at that time, I was already a teacher of the year. But what it did was it broke down all of the erroneous theories that I had internalized unconsciously. You know, because Piaget and Maslow say, well, at this age, a child should be able to do this, and at this age, they should be able to do that. Well, that was white psychologists looking at white children, telling you what white children should be able to do. Who was looking at our children? Amos Wilson was. And in the developmental psychology of the Black child, he tells us that all of the different tests that they run on infants when they come out of the womb. Now, these are Eurocentric tests, but on Black children, and Black children score the highest on all of them. On all, according to their measures. So there's something that's happening between the time that they're born and then when they go to school. So something is very wrong. And how many of you, let me just see a show of hands, how many of you have ever seen a group of Black students who have been unruly, undisciplined, and underachieving? Would you just raise your hand if you've ever seen that? Disrespectful, just raise your hand if you've ever seen that before, okay? Keep your hand up, look around the room, okay? Hands down. Now, how many of you have seen that same group of students with a different teacher? Now they're on task, they're asking questions, they're answering questions, they're being respectful. Keep your hand up, put your hand up if you've seen this. Look around the room. Okay? So this is why I say the teacher makes all the difference. We like to say, for those who think our children can't be reached, you haven't seen a master teacher teach. And one of the biggest tragedies is that most teachers have never been under the guidance of a master teacher that knows how to get tremendous results in some of the most challenging circumstances, and most principals have never been under the guidance of a master administrator who knows how to turn around a school in 1 to 2 years. Ashe? So the focus of my work and my journey has been to create a bridge between Afrocentric theory and classroom and home practice. Because I learned that when I went into the classroom with my 8th graders, I couldn't just give a lecture. Because that was how I was transformed, by going to conferences with Afrocentric scholars as a college student. But I couldn't do that every day with children. So I had to develop methods and activities. And as I would develop these methods and activities, I would share them with my other conscious colleagues, and they would tell me they used it with their students and how well it worked. And then I would develop worksheets and different things. And then when I began writing books, people would tell me how effective these things were with their students. And then those books started being circulated regionally and nationally, and now even internationally. So we have some of those materials with us here, and I invite you to take a look at them and please support the work that we're doing. And then finally, because of the literacy gap that exists in our community, we developed something called Reading Revolution Online. Let me go back for just a second when I say literacy gap. They're not achievement gaps, they're access and opportunity gaps. Ashe? Let me just clarify that. Our children oftentimes don't have access to quality teachers and curricula and well-funded schools. That's where the gap is. So the access and opportunity gap, the opportunity to have a qualified and certified teacher. So the access and opportunity gaps lead to what other people call the achievement gaps. But we developed Reading Revolution Online. You can go to readingrevolution.org for a free demo online. This is a collection of 90 brief reading selections about Black heroes and sheroes, ancient and modern. But because our children are multidimensional learners, we added a captioned video to go with each reading selection, because we know our children are very much visual learners. In addition to that, we have vocabulary activities, grammar, and writing activities to go along with the reading comprehension activities. So it's a comprehensive curriculum that we've developed. We have a goal. Y'all heard about Project 2025, right? Y'all know what that's about. Well, let me tell you about Reading Revolution 2025. Our goal is to reach 100,000 Black children with Reading Revolution Online, and we need your help to do that, okay? So there are some schools and school districts that sign on so that all the students, teachers, and parents can have access to this. And what we found is that most parents weren't taught these narratives about our history, and neither were the teachers. And we intentionally wrote it in such a way that you don't have to have a master's or a doctorate in Africana studies to understand it. You go on the journey with your students or your children. Ashe? So adults love it as much as the children do. So again, you can check that out at readingrevolution.org. But we have books, we have Black history posters, we have African proverb posters, we have multicultural education posters, all these different things that we've created on a teacher's salary, Ashe, to empower other educators to lead us back to excellence. Thank you.
Ashe, Ashe. Yes, please give a hand for that work. Yes. And we open the day today honoring the Queen Mothers and honoring our mothers and all of those women in community who have done the work of teaching and touching the spirit. And so I'd like to close with a recitation from Maria Stewart called "What If I Am a Woman?" What if I am a woman? Is not the God of ancient times the God of these modern days? Did he not raise up Deborah to be a mother and a judge in Israel? Did not Queen Esther save the lives of the Jews? And Mary Magdalene first declare the resurrection of Christ from the dead? Come, said the woman of Samaria, and see a man that hath told me all things that ever I did. Is not this the Christ? St. Paul declared that it was a shame for a woman to speak in public. Yet, our great high priest and advocate did not condemn the woman for a more notorious offense than this. Neither will he condemn this worthless worm. Did St. Paul but know of our wrongs and deprivations? I promise he would make no objection to our pleading in public for our right. Among the Greeks, women declared the oracles, the iami. Dr. Melva Sampson spoke on this morning. I promise he would make no objection to our pleading for these rights. The respect the Romans paid to the Sibyls is well known. The Jews had their prophetesses. The prediction of the Egyptian woman obtained much credit at Rome, even unto the emperors, and in the most barbarous nations, all things that have had the appearance of being supernatural, the mysteries of religion, the secrets of physics, and the rites of magic were and are all in the possession of the woman. So, what if I am a woman? Ashe, amen, aibobo. And so it is, and so it is. We have a moment for one or two questions, if there are any. Please come to the mic.
Good afternoon. So I have a two-part question. I was a teacher last school year, came out of the classroom to go to seminary. I taught fourth grade, and one of the things that I saw was the effect that the pandemic had on our children, right? That you could literally tell that a lot of my babies were on grade level up into the first grade, which was when they then went into the homes for education in school. They were given their devices, and it was left up to the parents to make sure that they were learning curriculum. So the first part of my question is, how do the studies that you all have spoken about from your tenure and your journeys, I guess, what are your projections and how does it apply to education post-pandemic, and how maybe things may have changed and how we can move forward as educators? And then the second part of my question is, as a parent, I have a almost 4-year-old son who had a developmental delay and was told by his pediatrician that he was on the autism spectrum. Representative Amber Baker, who is from North Carolina, when I shared with her what was going on with my son, she said, do not let them identify him as autistic. Go test him for giftedness. My son has an IQ level of a second grader. And so socially, he does not, he has a low EQ. He does not communicate socially because he was born in pandemic. So that's another theory that I have. He's a 2020 baby. But intellectually, he's reading, he's writing, and he's able to create on a second grade level. So I guess the second part of my question is, as a parent, how do we use these tools to educate parents of advocating for themselves and also understanding that, again, pandemic may have had a effect on our children socially, but that does not mean that intellectually that they are delayed.
That was a lot. There's a lot in that. I guess I'll start with my own experience with my son. My wife and I found out when our son was 18 that he was diagnosed on the high-functioning autism scale. And it was so interesting because both of us are educators, and we didn't see it. Had we known it, we would have parented him very, very differently. Now, I'm going to give you the end of the story first. He just recently graduated from college with a degree in computer game design and development with a minor in computer science and a second minor in software development, and has started a career in the aerospace industry. So doing phenomenally well. I'm going to see him. He just moved up to Hartford, so I'm going to take the train tomorrow to go and visit him. But in terms of what our children are missing socially and what the pandemic did, because it isolated us, it was, we are a very communal people, as you know. So we have to be very intentional about creating sacred space for our children to commune not only with the entire community, but with others of their own age. So that's a big thing. and constantly be mindful of teaching them strategies of how to engage with others, because oftentimes it may not be happening in school. People don't like to hear this, but I don't see any way out of our situation without it happening first at home. It has to start in the home. The challenge is for many of our parents, a lot of times they may not get involved with what's going on at school, because for them to come up to the school is for them to return to the scene of the crime of their own educational trauma. So we've seen a lot of problems with that. So I want to say that about, I'm so glad that you had somebody who told you not just to just accept what other people are telling you. My younger son at one time had complex motor tics, and it had the appearance of being something neurological. We took him to see all kinds of doctors. They ran all kinds of tests. They did brain scans, and we had a person with a PhD, MD from Emory who tried to put my younger son on the same medication that they put children on with ADHD. And of course, we didn't put him on that medication. So it's always important to look at alternative diagnoses to make sure that we don't allow people to label our children and minimize what our children are capable of. Okay, did y'all want to add to that?
Yeah, I have a good friend, and we've been in communication a lot because of her son's autistic diagnosis. But he got tested again, and he tested out of autism, right? And I think that speaks to who you have working with your children, right? Seek out people that see them, that have a lens of healing and liberation in their work, right? And also to the classroom piece, COVID or not, this still stands by Dr. Asa G. Hilliard. I have never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. There is no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings, and the second thing you do is love them. In my classes at Spelman, I have students saying the same thing. They're like, Dr. Thornton, I'm in a third grade class. The students are on first grade level, kindergarten level, but like Dr. Chike said, the work his sister did with him around social emotional built his confidence. Teaching skills to build his competence when children again know who they are. So yes, it's difficult now in these classrooms, but what we have to do as parents, and again, my work is with educators, what I support educators with doing is seeing children and meeting them where they are. The standard's gonna always be there. If the children are not meeting standards anyway, what I'm trying to say is that students don't meet the quote-unquote standards year after year. And they pass students along. Right now, we're in a difficult time out of COVID. Teach children where they are. The standard's going to be that if you teach them where they are, if you love them and help them know who they are, they will meet, they will grow. They will grow if they meet the standard or not. I don't care about standards, and I tell my students is, teach them children. Teach them where they are. Teach them where they need, and they'll get there. And I know standards are connected to teachers' jobs, right? But at the same time, again, students don't quote unquote pass the test. Teachers still have their jobs. Students move on, and that's this travesty within itself. That's another conversation. But we have to trust. We gotta trust who we are. We gotta trust the process. We gotta trust the scholarship. We gotta trust the traditions of Black teachers. We gotta trust everything we saying. We gotta trust in these classrooms, and that's when we'll see the difference.
Yes. I will say very quickly, there's a concept in education. It's very simple. It's called readiness. And children will get there when they're ready. We are moving with these systemic rules that say that this is where they should be at this point, in this time, in this space, in this place. But the intuition of a mother is greater than any tool that any teacher is going to give you. You know your children. Temperament is another one of those simple constructs that we like to make bigger than it is. A child will tell you if they want to go to school or not. Listen to your children. The children are like, some people will say, animals have a sixth sense, an instinct. You may see in church settings or other settings, oh, go hug Uncle Charlie. And the child's kicking and screaming because they don't want, something about Uncle Charlie ain't quite right. And the child knows that. And so we force them now. If you don't go hug Charlie, you're not going to McDonald's. And these are the messages that we then internalize as children going into adulthood, that I have to trust this person and engage with this person, even though everything in my deepest self says that something's not right. So listen to your children. Follow their lead. They will lead you. And so when we look at Head Start programs, like Mama Shakur developed, I believe in New York was the first Head Start program. These were programs developed out of the need in communities where parents were working parents. And they had other responsibilities. And so it was, again, how the village would embrace the child, feed them, love them, teach them, train them, rear them, steer them. But also recognizing that the children are the rearers and the steerers and the teachers. And so if we yield in some ways, and I'm not saying to discredit what medical professionals, what research they're doing, and what information they've discovered, but our intuition has guided us long on this journey, and it will continue to allow us to see our way home.
Ashe.
Ashe.
Ashe. Thank you so much to each of you. I see you as colleagues in doing this work. I'm very appreciative of what has been shared, both the questions and your knowledge here. I want to expand the conversation a bit to higher education, as each of you have shared your experiences in higher education. Because selfishly, I've traveled here with a group of students from Wake Forest University, and there are also students from McCormick Theological Seminary and other institutions. I have read this quote to several people today. It's something that all of you know, it's something that I know, but it's something about when you read something again, it just lights a fire. I've been reading this book you all may be familiar with, called Worse Than Trump, The American Plantation by Davon Love. And this is what he says: in order for black scholars and intellectuals to gain access to the white mainstream, they typically must use intellectual frameworks derived from works canonized by European American institutions. What often happens in practice is that black people will become well-read on the intellectual traditions of white people, and then will incorporate the ideas of black scholars who use the same scholars as their frame of reference. This means that black scholars and intellectuals often use, this means that black scholars and intellectuals often uses the intellectual constructs of white people to interpret black life. I'm naming that because just as standards are connected to teacher salaries, so is the tenure process for people in higher education. And often that process is based on, as what Patricia Held-Collins will tell us, the knowledge validation process that is governed by white heterosexual men. That if you are talking about black anything, or if I think there is interest in black women or Africana anything, that it has to go through their process of can you scientifically prove what you're saying? What are your primary sources? And if your primary sources cannot be calculated as being worthy or valuable, then you are not worthy of moving through the process. Then a gathering of strangers has to then validate whether or not what you said is good. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because for students, so for our adult learners who are moving through these processes, they are also facing what you've shared about our younger human beings. And so I just want you to speak a little bit, because each of you have gone through the graduate process. If you had a word to speak to students who are currently in process, and in process in predominantly white institutions, who mainly come into contact with black people who do things in white face, in a way in which they come into the classrooms feeling ill-equipped because they don't know the names that you mentioned, they don't know Kant, they don't know Hegel, all of the philosophers, and feel uncomfortable when someone like me invites them to bring their grandmama's name in the room, your first theologian, or to talk to them about bring Du Bois's name in the room. I guarantee you it's going to shut down, right? So what would you say to students who are matriculating and how to develop their voice in these institutions of higher education and how risky it is. But if you would speak to them on the worth and the value that it has in this space, I'd be greatly appreciative. Thank you.
You take it. No, you take it. No, you take it.
Yeah,
No,
no,
you take it.
Dr. Melva, Dr. Sampson, I think you said it best in your work. Do it scared. Do it scared. Oftentimes, you will be the only one who will give voice to your reality. And when you are free to do just that, you give someone else the freedom to do it for themselves. As a young child, and I go back to childhood because those are our formative years. It was President's Day, and we were given a picture of Abraham Lincoln to color. And I grew up in a home where my blackness was embraced. And so I got my brown crayon, and I colored him brown. And the teacher scolded me, grabbed my arm very forcefully, and told me, who is this? What is this? What is this? This is not right. And as a child, that was my first real experience with culture shock. And the shame that was induced. How dare you defile and deface our white national president this way? And so I sat with that humiliation all day. And when my parents picked me up that afternoon, I shared that with my mother. She got her purse.
Let's go. Go, Trip.
And she got my father. And they marched into the schoolhouse. And they had a conversation. And I don't really recall what all the conversation was about. But little black Abraham Lincoln ended up on the front window of the schoolhouse. And so it sometimes takes that pushback, that individuality, that personalization of oneself, and going forward, even if you're trembling and you're scared and you're stumbling, once you have spoken, your energy has gone out into the universe, and the universe will respond back in the glory and the beauty of your whole black self. And so I say back to Dr. Sampson's students and other students, no matter what, do it even if you got to do it scared. Yes, yes.
You know what's funny about that is there's a book by J.A. Rogers called The Five Negro Presidents. And you know one of the presidents he talks about in that book is none other than Abraham Lincoln. Black heritage. I thank you for that question, Dr. Melva. What's even more of a drag about what you said is when you go to an HBCU and encounter the same thing.
That's it, right there.
So I came face to face with that at the vestiges of colonialism at Hampton University, as well as at Clark Atlanta University when I worked on my master's degree. And I'll never forget, I was working on my master's degree in counseling, and first class I took was theories of psychotherapy, and we're going through all of these Eurocentric psychologists. And I finally asked the professor, I said, why are we learning all of these different theories when those theories don't even work for them? Because clearly they're crazy. And so what I had to do in each of my classes, and I didn't know this terminology back then, but Malefi Asante calls it taking two sets of notes. The notes that your professor requires of you, and then you have to go and do outside study to take the notes that your ancestors require of you. So I actually feel like I earned 2 doctorates, because for every assignment that I was given, I had to then go and say, well, what does Wade Nobles have to say about this in Seeking the Saku? What does Maulana Karenga have to say about this in Introduction to Black Studies? What does Marimba Ani have to say about this in Let the Circle Be Unbroken and Yoruga? What does Asa Hilliard have to say? For every concept, idea, theory that we discussed in any of the classes, I was going to black scholars and searching the books. Anytime we had the opportunity to do a project, I'm doing it on a black scholar or on their scholarship, on their theoretical approach, or on their practice. And that requires a certain level of intentionality and commitment. Because guess what? It's easy not to do that. But what you'll find is that once you start on the journey, you will be introduced to all of the different scholars that you need, but you won't be introduced to them up front. You have to be willing to take the first step. Ashe? So as it relates to how we engage that with our personal practice, for example, you've heard of standards-based education. This caused me to ask the question, well, what are our standards? Because I know there may be a few of us at the table, maybe, when they're making up all these national standards, Common Core standards, state standards, and all those things, but they're not reflective of who we are and what we need specifically. Ashe? So I developed the 15 Standards of African-Centered Education. You can see it, it's published in the Journal of Black Studies. At that time, it was 12 standards, and then we expanded it, and it's in my most recent book, Honoring Our Ancestral Obligations. So what it required me to do was to go back and look at all the different African-centered scholars and what our needs were as a people to determine what these 15 standards would be, and it's still expanding, right? Also had to come up with a definition of African-centered education, because in the literature, the definitions were literally a paragraph to a page long. So we had to condense it into something that everybody could understand. African-centered education is centering ourselves and our children in the best of African culture in order to examine and analyze information, meet needs, and solve problems in Black communities. I'm going to go through that again a little slower. African-centered education is centering ourselves. We must be centered before our children are. Ashe? Centering ourselves and our children in the best of African culture. At a time when most of them have not been taught the best, they've only seen and experienced the worst of it. So centering ourselves and our children in the best of African culture to do three things: examine and analyze information, meet needs, and solve problems in Black communities. And if you're not meeting needs and solving problems in Black communities, it cannot be said to be African-centered education. Ashe? So for the students here, you have to be very intentional to seek out those Black scholars, not just because they're Black, but because they have solutions to the challenges that we're facing.
Shay, thank you, Chike. I was just recently speaking with one of my mentors, and she was quoting Kais Layman, and he was telling a story about when he met with a Black author, and he said the author told him to write to and for your people. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in your work, students, in your thesis, in your dissertations, follow your intuition and spirit. Do the work of studying, write, be committed to writing to and for your people.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. When I was in sixth grade, I went down south to go to school, and I was on the floor doing my homework, and my grandfather said, "What is that?" And I had to teach it to my grandfather, who was a farmer in North Carolina, right? I said to say this here: how can we give parents the courage to look in their kids' notebooks? I know we have all these devices and parent portals and this here, but I tell parents all the time, look in your kid's notebook. Just say, "Let me see your notebook," and turn the pages and ask. Instead of saying the mundane, "How was school today?" "Fine." That's it. How can we give the courage or find a strategy to tell parents, look at your kid's notebook? That will let you know what's going on in school. Now, I know everything is online and in real time, but I want to find out how we give parents that, right, even though you don't understand it, ask your kids, say, "Listen, what's this about?" And if you can teach it, we know that if you can teach it, that means you understand it better than I do. So I want you guys to, and if I would get one of your books, the first one I would get was what? The first book, yeah. What book would I get? The first one I would get was what?
Honoring Our Ancestral Obligations.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have a question from online from Beverly Jackson. She asks, you say get the child tested by another entity. What entity is reliable?
So when I was speaking about looking for psychologists or evaluators, assessors. In the way that my friend found hers was through word of mouth. Like people, Black people that have good experiences, right? That get good information. Just like this young woman here who was told, no, go get the person tested again. So a psychologist, a person in a school that evaluates or assesses students, that maybe other people have had good experiences with?
I would add to that, if you go online to the Association of Black Psychologists and contact somebody there, they can probably refer you to someone as well.
There's also an educational system and center called AYA, A-Y-A, AYA Educational Institute. They do a lot of work around educating Black parents about Black children. They've been in business for over 25 years doing the work of Black and African-centered education. So that is a resource as well, AYA, 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 AYA Educational Institute.
Dr. Chike, could you give 3 maybe quick examples of how your sister helped you in terms of you called it socio-emotional. Can you give 1, 2, or 3 examples of, what that was all about?
Sure. Being the last of 5 children, I think my parents had been through quite a bit, and so they assumed that I would achieve and excel the same way that my sister and my brothers did. And it just didn't happen that way. I had different learning styles and different things of that nature. But the short answer to your question, what she did was she did the Jedi mind trick on me. She in a very positive and affirming way, told me how I was going to do. She sat down with me before my senior year, went through my schedule with me, and she told me what was going to happen in each class, what the content of each class was, what we would be discussing. And she would say, this class, this is what you're going to discuss in this class, and you're going to do real well in this class. I know you can get an A in this class. This class right here, this is what you're going to talk about. It may be a little bit more difficult, but I know you can get at least a B in this class. And she went through my whole schedule like that and just began to affirm and encourage me, not fuss at me or anything, just encourage me and tell me, what was possible. And it ended up happening almost to the letter for each class. What she said I would get was what I got. And what that suggests to me now as an educator is how to be affirming to our students, even when they may not be excelling very well. And going back to another one of our elders just mentioned, what can we do to get parents to be more active and involved in checking their children's work and so forth. Again, that requires intentionality. So as discouraging and upsetting as it can be, especially when you're working hard to provide for your children and you may be tired and may not feel like it, the things that we're talking about are not optional, they're absolutely essential. And when we ask our child, what did you learn at school today? Nothing is not an acceptable answer, unless you can qualify that, because at some schools they may not be learning nothing. But they need to be able to qualify that, well, what did you do for 8 hours then? And allow them to explain that. A lot of times they're exaggerating when they say they learn nothing, and when you start asking questions or contact the teacher, then you find out that there are some good things going on. So we have to keep the lines of communication open with our children, and to the best of our ability, keep it positive, while at the same time making sure we set high standards and support our children in reaching those standards. Lastly, when I mentioned my younger son who had complex motor tics, he doesn't have that anymore, and he's a sophomore at Georgia State University studying film and media studies, doing very, very well. So again, going back to these different diagnoses and things like that, it's always best to get second, third, and fourth opinions. So thank you for that question, brother.
Yes.
Yes. I had a grandfather that had sex and race book, and it was passed down from him to my mother to me, and I passed it on to my son. And they said in school that they wanted him to write an essay. And he wrote this essay, and he took it to school, and his white teacher said that he did not write that essay well because he wanted to know where did he get all the facts that was in the essay from. And my son said, well, my mother had a book at home with sex and races. And he said, I read up on it, and I based my essay from what I read with sex and races. So the teacher said, well, you go home and you tell your mother that to give you the book so that he could examine the book to find out if this essay was right or wrong. So I told my son, this book will never leave this house. I tell him it's sex and races, and that he could go and buy the book from the store. And he wasn't going to give him a mark on his essay. So he said, well, what I'll do is you stay after school and write another essay. And my son stayed after school and wrote another essay on something different. And he was astonished. He says, I can't believe that you read this book and that you read it so well that you could write an essay about what it was in the book. And he said, well, you know, because you sat here in front of me and wrote this essay, he says, I can't do anything but give you an A+ on your essay. But that's what happens in those schools at that time, because my son is now 60 years old. But back there in that time, they did not believe that a black kid could write an essay as well as he did at that time. And it just proves that you have to follow up on your kids in school and find out what's going on, because other than that, if I had let my son take that book to school, I probably would have never saw that book again.
So thank you for that story. Can we give her a round of applause for that? And do you remember when I told a similar type of story about what happened to me? Can you imagine going from that and then going to the pre-college program at Hampton, and I was given the award for the top writer in the entire program? And in the pre-college program, it wasn't students who had underachieved earlier like me. We were mixed in with all the students. Many of the students were trying to get a head start. They were A students and so forth. But my professor gave me the writing award for the entire pre-college program. What that signaled to me, going back to your story, is that at predominantly white institutions, black intelligence is called into question, but at HBCUs it's called into action. Let me say that again. At PWIs, black intelligence for students and professors, black professors, is called into question. But at HBCUs, it's called into action. And so we have to be intentional about being in spaces where we can be who we are and not have to prove to anybody about our greatness or our excellence. So thank you for that story.
Thank you. We've gone over in time. This is a robust conversation. We are so grateful for the engagement. We will stay back. If there are additional questions, brother, you have for us, but we want to honor the time and give space to what is next, what is to come.
Let's
so
give this panel a great big round of applause. Very informative. And we have another opportunity to all of our educators at 7 o'clock, across the street in the Family Life Center. There's a hush harbor that's going to take place. And you can receive more information and strategies that will help you in the classroom tonight. So we're grateful. One more time, give them a great big round of applause. We're a little behind schedule, so we'll take a 15-minute break and meet you on the lower level. This is the hands-on experience where you can learn how to build an altar. We'll see you in about 15 minutes. That is rehearsal hall on the lower level. Thank you.
On your way down, we have some books in the back, in the vestibule.